I'm going to talk a bit about transactional analysis. And transactional analysis, often just shortened to TA, is a psychoanalytic theory, and it does have some therapeutic applications as well. It was developed in the 1950s and 60s by a guy called Eric Berne, who wrote a book called Games People Play, which was published in, I think, 1964. And when we talk about transactions in transactional analysis, we're really talking about the exchange of communication between people. And during a conversation with somebody, it starts with one person starting the communication, which gives the stimulus, and the other person who receives that stimulus will give a transaction response. That back and forth, a packet of information being passed between these two people, is a transaction for the purpose of transactional analysis. And transactional analysis is basically how do we look at and understand the process and the content of these transactions in communication with others, and being aware of how people think, feel and behave during interactions with each other. And it really is based on this concept of human personality being broken down into different ego states. And so this is a system of understanding thoughts, feelings and behaviours, really from the different kind of parts of the psyche which are built up out of things that we've either been born with or that we've learned. So a bit of nature and a bit of nurture. And at the most simplistic level, these ego states are broken down into parent, adult and child. And so the most natural complementary, that's complementary with an E, transactions are between ego states that naturally talk to one another. So adult to adult would be a natural complementary transaction. Parent to child would be a natural complementary transaction. Child to child and child to parent would also be natural complementary ego state transactions, if you like. So back in the sort of 50s, when Eric Berne was first coming up with this idea, he was basing it on the original sort of Freudian psychoanalytic theory. And as you're probably aware from pop psychology or from your own psychological understanding and your own understanding of psychology, the idea of psychoanalytic theory is that childhood experiences have a huge impact on our lives as adults, and they are the basis for the development of our personalities, and any psychological or emotional issues or just the way that we function really stems from scripts that are laid down in our childhood. So Eric Berne builds on that, and he suggests really that our childhood experiences, particularly how we are parented, will affect the developmental formation of those three ego states that are referred to: the parent, the adult and the child. And that unconsciously causes us to replay some of the same attitudes and behaviours that our parents might have had towards us, so that we then basically replay those and almost reenact those things when we are in conversation or interaction with other people. So you almost retread the past, you retread the way that your parents treated you, or significant developmental figures in your life when you were age 0 up to 7, which is really that early formative years. The idea is that if there is dysfunctional behaviour or dysfunctional interaction, it's very often the result of some self-limiting decisions that might have happened in early childhood. Some of which happened for very good reasons, maybe in the interest of survivals or your own survival. So you end up with these life scripts that you just end up repeating and regurgitating unless you snap out of it, unless you find a way of deprogramming yourself from it. So the idea of, or the aim of transactional analysis based therapy is very much the reprogramming of those life scripts, changing them. So if you've got any sort of violent or dysfunctional organizational or societal scripting, you can replace that with a much more cooperative, collegiate, collaborative, non-violent and functional type of behavior, type of scripting. This is a pretty solid idea, and it's been built on an awful lot. But effectively, if you think about those three ego states, you've got the parent ego state, which is really the behaviors, thoughts, and feelings that we copied from our parents and our parent figures. So this is, if you think of the parent ego state as what it looks like to be in authority. So when we speak, when we're in a position of authority, when we act, when we're in a position of authority, to some extent, so the theory goes, we are reenacting what we saw, heard, felt when we were on the receiving end of that authority when we were kids. The adult ego state is really any behaviors, thoughts, and feelings that are a direct response to the here and now. So this is very, very much logic. This is about something that is less emotionally reactive. It's less about feelings and it is more about logic and taking things at face value and applying black and white rationalism to it, or rationality to the situation. The child ego state is behaviors, thoughts, and feelings that are replayed from childhood, very much from an affective point of view. So it's much more about your emotions. This is how it felt to be on the receiving end of these things. So you're kind of almost reenacting the way you were when you were a child back then. Obviously, you know, with the overlay of you now being an adult, this might feel a bit weird, but actually that does play out. You know, there's certain types of behavior which you are fundamentally still being the child that you always were. So which state we're in during an interaction kind of depends on several factors, such as obviously how we've been conditioned to act or react from childhood, past trauma that might now cause us to act in a certain way during particular interactions or situations, and how the other person we're interacting is treating us and what ego state they are speaking from. So if they are speaking to us from a particular parental tone, there's an increased likelihood that we will respond from a child ego state. Likelihood, if they're speaking to us as an adult, there's a very good chance we will speak to them back as an adult. If they're speaking to us as a child, we might respond as a parent or even as another child. There's an increased likelihood of that. So it's that stimulus and response piece. When we're interacting with somebody who is in the state of a child, you know, the parent mode is often the default or the unconscious reaction that's raised. So ultimately, we respond to what we feel. Let's break this down a little bit further. Child state. In the child state, you've got effectively two subdivisions. You've got the adapted child and you've got the free child, which is sometimes also referred to as the natural child. Okay. Now, the natural child is just emotion. It's raw, unalloyed, unfiltered emotion. It's the kind of emotion that doesn't have any conformity or societal norms. It's basically what you were born with. Whereas the adapted child is what you learn very quickly in order to be able to fit in and be able to function, which is that you put filters around your emotions. You don't necessarily show up with just this total joy, total fear, total sensuality, total sexuality, total emotion. You do not show up in that way in society. You put a mask on it. And that mask is the adaptation. That's the adapted child. And it comes in different flavors. So it might be, you know, a certain level of wanting to fit in and wanting to achieve acceptance through being quite compliant and saying what it thinks you want to hear, or it thinks the parent wants to hear, or the person in authority wants to hear. It might be quite rebellious in that it gets attention by sticking two fingers up to what the parent or the person in authority wants. Or it might even be the little professor, which is it's had its little strokes, its little psychological strokes quite a lot for being the cleverest person in the room, for being right, and it's that little sort of pat on the head as a child for doing things that are deemed to be quote unquote clever. So that sort of little professor type of adapted child is there. So you'll find that there's conformity to societal roles from an emotional point of view, to the expression of emotion. And you know, some of this is about attention. It's about reward. It's about positive and negative reinforcement. Hence, both the compliant adapted child and more of the rebellious child as well. There's also two subdivisions of the parent ego state. There's the critical, controlling parent, and then there's the nurturing parent. Now, the critical, controlling parent is quite judgmental. It's the voice that you know, we've been taught to listened to because that's where punishment comes from, it's where judgment comes from, it's also where potentially protection comes from at times. And on the other side, you've got the nurturing parent, which is very much the warm, encouraging, positive voice. But that can also be quite smothering and disempowering if it's not, if it doesn't have boundaries, if it doesn't have clearly defined parameters, if it's more about smothering than it is about empowerment. So you can have sort of positive and negative spins on both the nurturing and the critical parent. So people in the parent state, they tend to be in the parent state and when they're reactive to a situation and they're acting out their conditioning, really copying how parents or any other authority figure from childhood treated them and others, instead of kind of, analysing the situation for what it is. Now, to analyse the situation for what it is, you kind of need to be in the adult ego state. And unlike the other two, in the adult state, there aren't any subdivisions. Because the adult state is interacting with people and the environment in the here and now, not from past conditioning or not from how other people have told us to be. That state is much more open, much more rational. It's less quick to make harsh judgments on a situation or a person. So when communication occurs in the adult ego state, it's more likely that we've got a chance of having respectful, compromising, collaborative, fully present and fully listening social interactions. So it's fair to say that the adult ego state is probably the key to unlocking any reprogramming that we need to do. Now, those three ego states, child, parent, adult, affect how we receive, perceive and respond to information and communication from other people. And some of this, I referred earlier on to the idea of strokes, psychological strokes. Now, this is like the little kind of pats on the head that you get, just the little bits of social recognition, those little bits of, I suppose, oil that are poured on the wheels of social interaction. And for us to survive and thrive in society, we have to be connected to other people. We must, because psychologically we need that. We need that sense of belonging, that sense of tribe, that sense of collegiate, collaborative, or even just familial connection. So understanding this means that you can now notice that people will give and receive both positive and negative strokes, which can just be little bits of acknowledgement. They can just be a little nod. They can be a thank you. They can be a please. They can be a smile given at the right time in the right way. All of these little things are just little tokens of connection with another person that give them a sense of connection and a sense of psychological safety and a sense of being, I suppose, interacting with the other person. And they're all transactions, but they're little micro transactions that we call strokes, because they give the sense of some form of reinforcement, either positive or negative. So these different transactions will have like different chances of being functional as opposed to dysfunctional. Now, if you take the sort of top three types of transactions, you've either got complementary, and I'd say again, that's complementary with an E, which if you think about a complement of people in the army, it's a body of people. If you think about complementary medicine, it's holistic medicine that adds, to the whole. Complementary is something that matches. If it complements something, the two things match. So you think about the transaction being parallel lines that don't cross over. So parent to parent, adult to adult, child to child, parent to child. As long as the streams don't cross to go all Ghostbusters on you, then you've got a complementary transaction. So if a nurturing parent speaks to your adapted child and your adapted child responds to the nurturing parent, that is a complementary transaction. An ulterior transaction. Now, this is a little bit more confusing. In an ulterior transaction, you've got something where the sender is outwardly sending a message that sounds like it's coming from one particular ego state, usually the adult ego state. But actually, there's an underlying kind of hidden message, almost like a subtext, which is really, it's coming from a different ego state altogether. So you might find that ulterior motive, if you like, that ulterior transaction is very much like, I'm making it sound like I'm being very reasonable and I'm talking from my adult ego state, but the reality is that it's actually coming from my critical parent, and therefore I'm expecting your adapted child to respond. And we're clever enough and subtle enough to be able to pick up on this kind of thing, but it's not really, it's a bit disingenuous, and this is why Eric Berne's first book was called The Games People Play, because people do play games, and there is that kind of slightly disingenuous, sort of bad acting kind of way of talking to one another. A more overt form of conflict comes from crossed transactions. And cross transactions are when the ego states of two people interacting don't match. So when the ego state of the sender doesn't reach the desired or the intended ego state of the respondent. So what you find is that they will respond in a conflicting way. So if a parent ego state talks to a child ego state, and then the other parent ego state talks back. So you basically end up with two critical parents fighting with each other quite quickly, fighting for dominance. And sooner or later, you end up in a complementary transaction where actually an adapted child ends up talking back. Or alternatively, it just ends up going completely and utterly wrong. So in a cross transaction, it will require one or both of the people in the interaction to either shift ego states or to end it altogether, because otherwise the whole thing just is in catastrophe. It just doesn't work out. So this is a nice model for when you end up with broken communication. Now, in therapy, in therapeutic terms, the general goal or the idea of transactional analysis therapy is basically to try and strengthen that adult ego state. And now, I'm not suggesting that any of us should end up, trying to be, helping people with therapy here, but it's worth being aware that if you want to get really good quality functional conversations, try and stay in the adult ego state. Try to keep this as an interaction of equals, or to occasionally utilize your own nurturing parent in order to be able to help your prospective candidate to self-discover things which in their natural child state, which is where curiosity and creativity live, is actually a really healthy thing to do. So using transactional analysis skillfully in management, in coaching, and also in sales can be really, really useful, because if you're aware of which ego state you're speaking from, then actually very often just that awareness tells you that you're already in the adult ego state, and then you can choose to communicate from the parent ego state, maybe the nurturing parent ego state. And that's the one thing you don't want to do is, if you're in control of a conversation, is you don't necessarily want to spend too long in the child ego state yourself, because it's very, very easy to lose control of the conversation. So when you're analysing these scripts, when you sort of find yourself responding negatively or unhelpfully, then look at where that's coming from. Is that coming from something which you learned in your childhood? How do you overcome that? What are the sort of subtle messages that you received growing up? These are the sorts of things that, when you want to reprogram your scripts, you kind of need to understand where they came from in the first place. And quite often, if you've got kids yourself, you'll see it. You'll see your own kids starting to almost ape you, to sort of copy you, and you'll hear your words and your tone, and you'll see your gestures being reflected back at you. It's kind of cute to start with, and then it's kind of scary when you realise just what an impact you're having on this young psyche that is developing in front of you. I'm not suggesting that TA is the be-all and end-all. I'm not suggesting it's the only model that's out there. However, it is a very useful model to understand if you want to understand how people communicate, and fundamentally for management, for sales, for coaching, for any real kind of thing where you're building a team, when you're building relationships, understanding communication is pretty fundamental. And as such, this model is probably one of the best that I've ever come across. And if you understand it, or if you gain a basic understanding of it, then you can also start to understand the drama triangle as well, which was a further model which was based on transactional analysis. And the drama triangle is something you've definitely heard me talk about previously. It was proposed by a guy called Stephen Karpman, who was one of Eric Berne's students. And Karpman as a student not only of Eric Berne and of transactional analysis, but also of drama, recognized that certain ego states were typically in play for drama, for conflict to come about. And he recognized that the unhealthy critical parent voice takes on the role of a persecutor in drama. And the unhealthy victim voice of an adapted child who is basically looking for excuses and looking for attention because it wants to be mollycoddled. That is the victim voice. Again, an essential component for drama to take place. Somebody who is not going to take accountability for his or her own actions and instead is looking for that sort of oh there kind of attention. Or at a push, even just the attention of somebody who's going to say, oh, pull yourself together, because some attention is better than no attention when it comes to this kind of reinforcement. And then the third one, which is implied by what I've just said, is really the mollycoddling, smothering, disempowering version of the nurturing parent. This is a negative nurturing parent. And that comes out as the rescuer. And that is really the most insidious of the three participants in any given drama, because very often when one shows up as a rescuer, one tends to show up as somebody who is actually the good guy or the good girl, the one who's there to help. But if you're helping without boundaries, without permission, then all you end up doing is actually mollycoddling, wrapping up in cotton wool, disempowering, and thereby actually perpetuating the drama. You can also end up becoming a persecutor to the person who started out as the persecutor, thereby turning them into the victim. And then maybe the victim, the original victim, becomes the rescuer. The cycle can continue. The rule here is that you do not have to attend every fight to which you're invited. And as such, if you don't have to attend every fight to which you're invited, you need to be able to step back from drama so that you remain in the adult ego state. You channel just a little bit of your own natural child to be curious enough to ask searching questions, but as an honest broker, not as somebody who's trying to needle and trying to perpetuate the drama, but as somebody who is actually trying to solve the things, solve the problems, but also to do so in an empowering way as a positive nurturing parent. So instead of being the victim, you end up being a little bit of a creator. You're trying to create solutions using your curious natural child ego state. Instead of being the persecutor, you are the, I suppose to some extent, you're almost like the coach. You're trying to create, or at least, no, you're more of a challenger than a coach, actually. You're trying to challenge the other person to think of different things, but you're doing so in quite a positive, nurturing way. And then instead of being the rescuer, that you are actually a coach there, instead of being a rescuer. At that point, you are definitely coaching the other person to help them to self-discover ways to, I suppose, move through from this particular challenge. And you're doing so in a very positive, empowering way with permission. And that's a really critical thing, because if you show up and you ask for permission in your adult voice, let me ask you a question. Can I have permission to just ask you a slightly challenging question there? Not in any way that critical of you, just, let's just approach this with a real open mind. That adult permission then allows you to go into a nurturing tone of voice to coach and to ask questions that are constructively challenging rather than destructive and judgmental, and which would obviously lapse into the persecutor tone. So hopefully that is a useful primer in transactional analysis. Hopefully it's something that you find useful and interesting, and I look forward to talking to you about it much, much more.